Hello, welcome to Cinema Savvy, and welcome back to Retro Reviews. So, as we said, we've dragged ourselves away from the 80s for this week at least, and as you can see from the title above, we are here today to talk about the 1995 crime film Heat, directed by Michael Mann, written and directed by Michael Mann. This is one that we've both watched a good while ago. More recently now, obviously, we've watched it for this review. But this was one that we both wanted to talk about, and we both mentioned it. I think originally we were going to talk about Scarface, I know was mentioned with the Al Pacino link, and then we naturally went to this. And we had a blast watching this one today, and we've got a lot to talk about. So as always, this is going to be completely spoiler-filled. So by God, if you haven't seen Heat, or you haven't seen Heat in a while, go and watch it again, because this is a film that everyone needs to see. So this is going to be a deep dive. We're going to talk about the film itself, and probably a big enough section of this review is going to be talking about its influences, because this is a very influential film, especially one of our favorite directors, favorite filmmakers, and one of our favorite films, which we'll get onto later. But before we do so, George, over to you with the socials.
Definitely, guys. So as we always say, the best way to find out what we're going to be doing is by getting us on social media. That is Facebook, Cinema Savvy, Twitter at Cinema_Savvy. For anyone that does have us on there, you'd have seen us teasing a lot of February videos earlier this week. So we'll get you more details on those. But as we said, the best way to find it is going to be on socials. We will unveil next week's retro review at the end of tonight, as we always do. I don't want to give a little hint away, but we're heading into a little trilogy. We're going to take things out of single films, head to a trilogy for a couple of weeks and see how they go. But
we are going back to the 80s as well. I did say, yes, like, for the intro of this, we're going to the 90s for 1 week at least, and then we're going straight back to it. But yeah.
1 week, and it feels very 90s. Sorry, it feels very 80s, this, but we'll get into that. But do comment along with us. We know a lot of people love this film. I've never met someone that has disliked this film. So if you do, even comment that. If you dislike it, and why you're watching it, and why you do dislike it. But of course, if you do like this video, if you do like some of our other stuff, then do subscribe to us as well. It does help. We've got goals we're working towards. We've some crazy videos coming out, and we've got some really big announcements. And I guess we can officially say, next week, at some point, is the key word, at some point, we're going to be having our 1000th video. We've got very fortunate with a couple of screeners, so we've had to rejiggle our schedule around, and we now know our 1000th video is going to be next week, not the week after. So more details on social media and what we plan on doing with that. But we are here to talk about Heat, and as we always do, we're going to go into the first time we saw this. Is this the first retro review since Rocky where we've both seen it at least once?
Both seen it. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, no. So we did the Karate Kid films. You hadn't seen those, or you hadn't seen them in a while. I guess Karate Kid 1 you saw a long time ago, hadn't you? But it's not very often. It's either, well, actually, compared to how long ago that I actually originally saw this film, this was kind of like a new watch to me today, because I had forgotten so much of this film. And ironically, I didn't even remember the bank heist all that much, really. I knew there was a bank heist in the film. I didn't specifically remember the scene itself. The one scene that sort of stayed with me the most was the final standoff where they're sort of all ducking behind those things at the airport. That was the one scene that stayed with me the most. Now, I first watched this film. If anyone watched our 20 unique film stream, you would have seen Tom on there. So me and Tom went to uni together, and second year, you know, I used to go and he was just watch all these films that I hadn't seen at that point, and Heat was one of them. And I watched it many, many years ago now. And when you don't go back to a film for a long time, or, I mean, we watch a lot of films in between as well, so your mind's constantly shifting and focusing on different films. It just falls to the wayside, and you just, you know, as the years go by, you forget more and more about it. But this is why I loved going back to this today, and this is why I love this show that we do with retro reviews, because it's great to go back to some of these older films. And I had a blast with this today, and I thought, why haven't I watched this film more than what I already have? But then you also made a good point. It is one of those crime films, and actually say, after watching it today, it probably would be a good contender for possibly one of the best crime films ever put to cinema. Depends how you rank crime films / gangster films. You know, you've got stuff like The Godfather or Goodfellas. That's more of like a gang film, I would say. This is more straight up crime film. It's a very long sit. It's almost pushing 3 hours. It's 2 hours, 50 minutes, I believe. But this is just incredible. Absolutely just incredible feat of filmmaking, especially acting as well. And I think it's a very strongly written script down to its characters. But yeah, so it was interesting when I got towards the end of the film and you're at the final act and you've got the final standoff. Suddenly something clicked and I was like, oh, I remember watching this now. I remember how it all ends now. but it was literally just down to that ending, really. How about you?
Yeah, this is fascinating. So I think I mentioned this on one of our retro reviews that when I was younger, let's say the teen years, secondary school, I would go to one of my neighbours every Thursday night for at least 2-3 years. Pretty much every Thursday on command, we would put on like a film. They're both older than me as well. Him and his best mate. So they're the people that grew up in the 80s and 90s. So I got to see all those classics via those guys when I was a lot younger, getting them games that were 18 when I was like 13, 14 and stuff. So I remember going around once and said, what film are you watching this week? And they said, I'm watching Heat. I was like, never heard of it. And they showed me the DVD cover, which is one of the most recognizable posters probably of all time now. And I said, sorry, I don't know anything about this. And they're like, whoa, like you are in for it's a long one tonight, but it's going to be worth it. I was like, okay. I saw a lot of great films. So I was like, okay, just give me another great film. And I remember watching that for the very first time, and they were both excited like school kids because it's one of their favorite films, clearly. And it was approaching the bank heist, and they're like, it's about to go down. And I was like, when people say things like that, it's like, okay, like you piqued my interest. And we'll get to that later on. And same as you, I remember the ending more than the bank robbery. I mean, I remember the bank robbery was coming back to me as I was watching it, but it'd been a while. But I think the ending's so unique, so different, and it's worth getting to actually later on as well, that I've not seen a sort of climax like that before. And I think it just come down to the writing and the performances and also location. And I remember Kurt saying that was a masterpiece, and I loved it. And it's a film I think I might have gone back to once since until this week, and I'm very strange. I've been like this with The Godfather. This is very strange, actually. Sorry, no, I'm going on about. So you know me, I can rewatch Star Wars on command. I can rewatch many films on command, but there are some films where I'll try and watch them as little as possible. I'd like to rewatch them. Let's say Tarantino is probably a perfect one. I've probably not seen any of his films more than probably 4 or 5 times, and a great film. The less times you watch it, the better it is. And it's not that you find flaws. It's that if you can leave a long enough gap between watching them, you not forget things, but you don't have the knowledge of every line like Star Wars, of every joke, of every landing, and you remember bits of it, but not so much of it. And I had a really conflicting emotion with the gangster films, crime films, because they're always sort of 3-hour epics, and I don't want to go into them knowing every single moment that's going to come up next. So I'm quite sparing in how I go about rewatching these. However, after rewatching Heat this week, I'm kind of sat there like I really want to watch it again now. You know, there's a 4K master which he redid in 2015, which we'll get to later because it involves Christopher Nolan. That's not been released on 4K. They did a definitive Blu-ray cut with like an extra line or two or some, you know, that kind of nonsense. But going back to this week, and again, it's probably around about 10, 11 years ago now, which scares me. The first time I saw this and felt like going in, you know, as you get older, you pick up more. This is probably the first time seeing this since being at uni, so I had even more respect for this. But I've not seen any of the Michael Mann films in this as well. And this was quite something. I'd maybe having to reevaluate my top 20 films because I've not deep dived into a film prepping for a video in a long time compared to what I've done the last couple of days.
Yeah, and there's a lot of fascinating behind the scenes with this film as well, which we'll get into in a second. Chief among them, it's kind of loosely based on a true story, which I completely wasn't aware of at all. And then also there was a TV pilot, and we'll get into this a bit more in depth later, that Michael Mann himself worked on. In the past, he worked on Miami Vice. I actually think he directed do you remember oh God, what's his name? Irish actor Colin Farrell and Jamie Foxx reboot they did. I think it was like in around like the mid 2000s of Miami Vice. I think Mann directed that, so he was tied to those crime TV shows from back in the day. I think he worked on a couple of episodes of Miami Vice in the 80s. And I know that he worked on an early draft of what would eventually become Heat, which was sort of like packaged as a straight to TV movie. I think it was called. I've just lost the name on here. LA Takedown. They wanted him to write like a new TV show at the time, and then eventually it would be adapted, and they made him cut it down to 90 minutes. But the full, almost 3-hour script that he wrote is what would become Heat. So it's quite a fascinating history to it, really. But no, I'm like you with films like this, and especially sort of long films and well-respected films. It's not that I'm not respecting those films by not watching them a whole bunch of times, but the more you watch them, I say, the less special they become. Some can still merit from repeat viewings, as you mentioned, like Star Wars. Like, absolutely can watch that any day of the week. But and having time away from it, especially almost a decade, what you said, and I'm trying to think back now. It must have almost been that for me now, or just almost pushing a decade since I last saw this film. You do get that sense of rediscovering it, and I think that's a really big part of it as well. That being said, the 4K master, I was watching this film, and especially when you get to the bank scene and some of the scenes of just pure spectacle and the sound as well. We'll talk about the sound and just like the sensory overload this film has. If cinemas ever do reopen, if that's everything that we are going to go back to, I would love to see a 4K re-release of this film in cinemas. This is a film where I was watching it on my small screen right here, and the mind boggles at what this would look like on the big screen with that sound system. Now, I would say I have heard your sound system, and your sound system is almost pushing a cinema standard for the sound system, but this needs a re-release. I would love to see this on the big screen. And even like 95, and I was watching it too and thinking, I always bang on about the 80s and the 80s films, and I do stand by that, but the 90s had some great films, really good films, like especially crime films like Seven, this, Silence of the Lambs, all those films just so good for that decade.
Yeah, and I think that's what's fascinating with this is that I think with the 80s, because it is that golden era of the action hero, which we've been covering for ages, and we adore those heroes and those films. The 90s is this weird, I'm not saying it's a transitional decade, but when you think of the noughties, you think of the upcoming of CGI, that look at the year 2000 versus 2009, and that's been very much a technological advancement decade. Whereas the 90s is so interesting because it's kind of not a midpoint between the 80s and 90s, because obviously it is, but the vibe and the look of films, like you've still got that gritty action aspect that you'd have from the 80s, but they tried to take some of the action away, put a bit more story on it, and a bit less over the top. We talk about like the blood bags that you see and stuff. The 90s kind of, I want to say, not remastered the 80s, but it very much took the great bits of the 80s and put a new approach on them, and that worked. And the noughties went a completely different direction. I mean, it's really, really pathetic to say you're not going to get a film like Heat in the noughties. Well, we got one like it, which we'll talk about later on. Except for the obvious one, not many others. We'll talk about its influence at time. GTA, which when that was pointed out to me, it was so obvious that it did become like this, and it was just so nice to go back to. And I think because you've still got those, I mean, when I think of Pacino and DeNiro, of course they're around in the 80s, but to me, like, don't sound horrible, like it's like the 70s for them, right? That to me, it's Godfather. It's seeing those early films of them. I mean, Scarface, yes, it's the 80s, but because I associate the 80s so much with Arnie, Stallone, all those guys, not these, that's why it stands out so different. But he is one that everything I've read about has been fascinating. Even the potential casting choices. You mentioned, oh my God, I forgot the name of the film you mentioned that Michael mentioned after, Miami Vice.
Yeah.
The TV show had Don Johnson, and Don Johnson was almost cast in this film. And ultimately, his first choice for every role was De Niro and Pacino. But there were other names thrown around. But more importantly, when we get to Val Kilmer, I don't know if you've read this yet. There is an actor that was originally cast that had to step down, which will blow your mind. And I'm not going to unveil it till we discuss Val Kilmer's character.
I'm just going to throw out Nicolas Cage. That's the only name that's coming to mind immediately.
No, but there is a Nicolas Cage reference for something we'll talk about later from a real life shooting that happened after that was turned into a film starring Nicolas Cage. Oh God, this film was, I think, with Heat as a really initial invite into it. It's not the fact that you've got these great action scenes, you've got a great crime thriller, because Michael Mann's writing and creating these characters. And I kind of said before we hit live that I feel as if I've known every character that is of any importance in this film, whether it be the villain, whether it be the protagonist, antagonist, whether it be the driver of the car who's really built up to be in it for 30 seconds, or the mother of a dead girl that we're going to meet for a minute and never see her again. Every single character feels, I don't want to use a Tarantino comparison because it's unfair, but it feels as if like this is an established world and we're taking a look into it for a couple of hours and going. Mm-hmm. And there's just so much going on. I don't know if you had any thoughts, like the writing for this I think is perfect, and it is as a broad stroke, this is probably one of the best films I've ever seen. And I'm not overreacting. This is something where I really want to rewatch it, but I don't want to rewatch it. And that's when you know it's good. Always happens whenever I watch the first 2 Godfather films.
Yeah, and I said to you earlier, and we've both discovered this, Heat is one of those prime example films like The Dark Knight, which we're definitely going to talk about the comparisons between that later on in this review, but you could easily write a dissertation on this. There is so much to unpack from this film. So much, especially down to its characters as well. And I guess I'll mention it now. I said we'd mention it later, but loosely based on true events, there was a criminal, an ex-Alcatraz convict called Neil McCauley, exactly the same name as Robert DeNiro's character in this, who was being tracked down by Detective Chuck Adamson, and this was in the 60s, like the early to mid-60s. So I wasn't aware of that, and it goes on to say that there was like a big mass shootout, and one of the gang did shoot his way out of like a police blockade, and elements of that are obviously taken with Heat, with Val Kilmer's character. But yeah, you talked about the characters and the writing. The writing's outstanding to this thing, and I think it's all down to Michael Mann. This was his baby. This was clearly a story that he wanted to tell many, many years back when he was working in his television days. And, you know, the studio says, we want a new crime TV series, go write one. And he came up with this concept here, and they made him cut it down, and it wasn't really what he wanted it to be. But it's outstanding. Yeah, every single character has an arc, has a point. Everything's so tightly written. And I think you wouldn't, you know, if you were going to like condense this down to like an hour and a half to 2 hours, if you were going to cut, say, like an hour or more out of it, you would probably lose some of those side characters and side stories and everything like that. But to me, it makes it seem more human, and I think it adds to the theme of the story, because the big proponent of the whole story for me is that moral gray area, and we'll definitely talk about that when we get into De Niro and Al Pacino's character. And I think when you see some of those real human lives and relationships and the reality of, you know, people being murdered and what the repercussions have on the family and everything like that, it does add to that sense of the world, the dangers that they're facing, the life and the things that Pacino's character is having to take away and, you know, go home to. We see him go home, and, you know, he's drinking, he's got like a bottle of whiskey on, he just wants to disconnect completely, and because of that he disconnects from real emotions in his life. That's just one character, but everything is so tight in it together, and yeah, it just makes the world seem more believable, bleak, and human. So when you do get to those moments where you have had a backstory about a guy who gets a job at a diner, you know, like washing dishes or whatever he's doing, when his death does happen later in the film, you feel something, because you at least have some kind of a connection. And it might only be 2 scenes, it might only be 3 scenes, but it has a point to it, and all those points add to the greater whole as a film, I think.
Yeah, and this is what's been fascinating reading into it, is that Michael Mann spoke about the film and said that we've got the core story happening. We've got the police tracking down De Niro's gang, the robbery going wrong, and what happens at the end. But he said, I wanted to make these real people he said, if you look at every other scene of them, if you take away the core plot, every other scene of it is people at home with their wives or out for dinner or in their personal life. And I think that's why normally, you know, there are films that certainly me and you have come out and said that could have been shorter, could have been longer. This is 2 hours and 50 minutes because it's telling 2 stories, the story of everyone's personal lives and the story, which is Heat itself. And I think that's what's made it fascinating for me, that there are so many films that have had this, not necessarily had this direct approach, but there are so many films like this in the sense that they're written so specifically. But I'm just struggling to think of any. I mean, talk about best writing. Maybe we'll do a video on one in a month or two as a little tease. But I always go back to the ending of the first Godfather film, that the first time I saw that when I was younger, I thought, you know, a couple of people get killed and he takes the throne. And then I remember watching it a couple of years back. I was like, oh my word, that is just masterful. Mm-hmm. That is perfectly written. And that's what I felt like watching Heat this weekend. And I think that's why it works. And everyone's different. They've all got their different personas. Yes, they're in a gang, but they don't have 4 people that are the exact same. They don't have 4 people in perfect families. They've got one with the cheating wife. They've got the guy that's the lone wolf that falls for someone. They've got the family man that wants to carry on doing his job. And I think all of those things combining is what you mentioned as well with Al Pacino. He probably has the worst life of them all. He's on his 3rd marriage. The marriage is failing. his wife's cheating on him. One of the funniest scenes of the film with the TV.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also got the stepdaughter Natalie Portman in her second role. I'm sorry, but anyone that's first two films are Leon and Heat. It's clearly a star in the making.
Mm-hmm.
That is extraordinary. And that's the thing, looking back, again, hindsight 25 years later, we can look back and say that's Natalie Portman's second film, and obviously she went to do so many other things as well. But it's crazy when you see these younger performers. I think is it Jodie Foster from Taxi Driver? People always talk about a lot as well, and I think there is some kids where on the spot that they're going to be around for a long time and they're going to be gifted. I think, not to be horrible and take away from Heat, but I think 11, Millie Bobby Brown's probably one of the current generation of the sort of the child actors that is going to have a big career. Not to be harsh on the others, and even she has a story. She's got the dad that's never there for her that leads to obviously her other stuff. And I don't know how he did it. I mean, I can see how it was written for TV. That the fact that he could probably elaborate on the home lifestyle so much. Because TV in modern day, we can discuss it's a 10-hour series. There's got to be certain points within that. And I think he was right to make this as a film. I would hate the fact someone's probably tried to pitch a remake of Heat. I know Michael Mann said in the past that he thought about doing a prequel book that he wrote, but he's never released it. If it's a book, please release it. But I don't know. There's something, I mean, we haven't even spoken about the characters really, but the fact that I think the directors, when you've got Pacino and DeNiro, to me, the MVP of the film is Michael Mann. It's not actually any of that cast, and that is an extraordinary cast as well, with incredibly written characters, and everything's down to Michael Mann.
And what's quite groundbreaking as well in terms of, we'll move into like the main characters now. We're going to unpack all the characters. There's a lot to unpack with this film, as I mentioned at the beginning, but this broke new ground in that it was De Niro and Pacino actually face-to-face. Now, they had featured together in Godfather 2, but separately. Obviously, you've got the flashback scenes with Don Corleone and Michael and how that plays out. I mean, it's great that they got them both in the same film, but they never actually appeared together and acted together in that film, whereas this was the first to do it. And then since then, we've had Irishman recently. I'm trying to think of, did they do anything else together along the way? I feel like they probably did. I'm just not.
There's probably a terrible comedy from the noughties.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, they both kind of descended into that territory, didn't they? But let's start with De Niro. And I was conscious of that, the whole thing, how he moved into comedy. And, he can do comedy, but some of those films are really not that good. De Niro, especially around this time, when he started his career with stuff like Taxi Driver and, Say What You Want About Raging Bull. Maybe that's a film that I'll go back to again at some point and give another shot. But I know that we're not the biggest fans of it as a film, but performance-wise, you can't take that away from De Niro in that film. He brings such an intensity to some of his roles, and he can be like a genuinely scary guy. And he has elements of that in this film as well. He plays it very intensely, but again, it's that moral gray area between the two, because and between the two main characters, Pacino and De Niro, they both have their own personal code that they stick to. I hate using this phrase, and I really need to get a different phrase that describes the same thing, but we always say two sides of the same coin, and that is a perfect description of the two main characters in this film. De Niro, we don't know everything about his past, but from whatever events have led him to here, this is what he does. He arranges jobs. He is a robber. He is a criminal, essentially, and he has lived that life, and that is his life, and he knows no other, and he's good at what he does. And, he does deep down, I think, want that normal life, or at least an element of it, or he needs that to be present in his life, and we see that through the relationship that he tries to kindle. But we know ultimately that everything, especially leading a life like this, is doomed to fail. And he has that great line which gets a fantastic payoff at the end of the film, a very emotional payoff, where he says, I'm paraphrasing here, he says, don't get attached to something that you wouldn't just drop within 5 minutes and go, like if it came down to it at the situation. And then we see that beautifully paid off at the end, where he just takes one last look and he's gone. Absolute self-preservation. You get the sense that he's a survivor. He's been in plenty of situations before, and he's managed to get out of it. And he will literally go down. He will die. He would rather die than get taken down in prison and be caught. So it's this beautiful cat and mouse story that you have between the two of them. I guess I'll pass it over to you now, so we focus on De Niro before jumping to Pacino. But I know we're going to get onto our Dark Knight thing, but again, beautifully mirrored in Dark Knight with Batman and Joker, how you have that cat and mouse chase played out almost exactly in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what works with, I guess, both is that you have an antagonist that it's not. I'm not going to say he's right. He's obviously wrong. He's a criminal. It's like the whole Thanos argument. But morally, he's in. Oh, not even morally, I guess. But he's an antagonist that's portrayed as a protagonist. That when you watch him across the film, he's a family guy. He's looking out for his friends. He's trying to get them on the good spot. Take the Val Kilmer stuff. He says to the wife, you're given one more chance. Just one more chance for me, for my sake. Doesn't work, I'll give you money. You get away. You get your new life. Mm-hmm. And there are these moments where there's this sense of respect there, and this is what I love. Actually, something I've actually brought into the real world. It's more the Pacino stuff we'll get to, but there's an immeasurable respect between the pair of them. That the coffee scene, I guess we should save till later, because that's one of the most famous cinema scenes. Mm-hmm. The moment where we're introduced to him from the opening heist, where things go wrong, he's calm, he's calculated. That when he turns up, he's not turning on Waingro, he knows that Waingro's fucked up. He knows he's killed these people. It's cost 3 lives. It's almost costing their job. And hate being obviously the not just the title of the film, but the term used when the police come in. It's drawing heat to them. And his one goal is to not go back to prison. Nothing's going to take him back. And he's such a fascinating character to study. Even these little bits when he builds up his relationship. She says, I recognize you a few times. And then you just think, is he going to headshot her? Does he think it's a spy or something? And then he realizes that she's genuinely a nice person. And it's fascinating learning about him that, he's got a brother somewhere, a father somewhere. He doesn't have the family. He keeps himself to himself. And I loved all that personal stuff with him. But when it came down to the efficiency of the bank, even robbing the bank, right? He says, this isn't your money. Your money is safe. Yours is, protected by basically the country. We are here for the bank's money, not a penny of yours. It's like, do not try and be a hero. If you've got issues, please stand away, go to the wall. We're not going to hurt you. And yes, he's robbing a bank, but it's the way in which he's doing it that exactly he's gone there to rob the bank's money, no one else's. And that's what's fascinating, that he's painted in this very different light as not a savior at all, not a Robin Hood type, but you feel as if there's something more going on with him there. Not that he wants to use the money for good, but he's got a very wary perception. But that's what makes him so cold-blooded. That if he has to, he will turn. And I think when we get into the team, obviously some of them like to take people hostage. Some of them will try and shoot normal pedestrians. Whereas DeNiro is always calm. He's always calculated, and he will only do what he has to do. And I think that's what makes him work. And that's ultimately his downfall is the relationship he falls for, is that personal vendetta that he could have played it safe and got out of town, but instead he went back to kill the person that is the reason why the heist fails, which ultimately cost him his relationship, his life, and a new start. And I think that's what's fascinating from a character standpoint, is that he is so in control of every scenario, even up to the point of escaping. He's at that car door when he spots Al Pacino. And I think that's why he works. And it's the ultimate, as you said, it's the cat and mouse stuff. And I think he was absolutely perfect. It's impossible to say what's your favorite, what's the best De Niro performance, because he's so varied. But he is always in the top 3 when I'm discussing it with people.
Yeah, definitely. And he has morals, almost like a man without morals still does have his own morals. And you see at the beginning, you have what is an absolute psychopath and crazy loose cannon, which is the character of Waingro, who's terrifying, especially when you get to that scene where he's with the prostitute in that scene, and then we ultimately see what happens to her and what he's capable of, in that he just guns down those cops in cold blood at the beginning when they really didn't have to. And when they load back into the truck, you can hear De Niro is very pissed off by that, and they had to do what they had to do, and they had to shoot the rest of them. But he didn't want to do that. And it's ultimately that personal code. And it's the personal code that ultimately ends up being the undoing of De Niro at the end of the film. It's that he has the choice. It's quite beautifully visualized, really, down a highway. You've got the left option or the right option. Do you choose a normal life, or do you veer off down this path, which is, the path of violence and revenge and everything like that? But you get the impression if he had have gone down that path and he had have, tried to build a life for himself, that would have been eating away at him the whole time. And De Niro plays it brilliantly when he's in that car, and you can see him just like everything behind the eyes, like weighing up both options before he eventually decides to get it. He would never have left that life behind. And that's ultimately what dooms him at the end. So It's a beautiful sort of like cautionary tale between the two. But we need to get on to the other side of the coin with this, with Pacino, because my God, Pacino is a fantastic actor. Like, yes, he has done a lot of shitty comedy films. So has De Niro. So has a lot of people as well. And it's kind of a shame where you do see them in I think Pacino was in, oh God, what was the Sandler movie where he did the
he was
Dunkachino? What was that one?
I was going to say Dunkachino's the meme. That's I don't know if that was a real advert or if it was the Adam Sandler film.
It was the Adam Sandler film. It was the advert in the Adam Sandler film.
Jack and Jill, but
I think that was it, Jack and Jill. So you see him in something like that, and that's hilarious for what it is. But when you go back to stuff like the original two Godfather films and you see what Pacino was, I mean, thankfully he came back with Irishman, and that's where he really gets to sort of, go back to how he used to be. But something changed with Pacino, and I think it was probably, I've got to say it was like the mid 80s maybe, because like 70s Pacino is that, and when you get to Godfather, it's that very quiet, reserved, methodical Pacino. Yeah,
the kid in the Godfather. I mean, he's the young Corleone kid as well, but yeah, there's the switch.
You get to Scarface in like the 80s, and then he sort of embodied that character, and that coasted into the 90s with this. And Insomnia was, I want to say 2002, was it? Was it into the early 2000s? Where he just has these outbursts, and I don't know if they're improv. It's Pacino being Pacino, and it's fantastic. And I was sending you like a bunch of clips earlier as I was watching it. His outbursts in this film make it. Now, I love his character, and the character does have a lot of depth to it. He has this failing marriage, this failing relationship that he's got. He's also being like a stepdad, like a surrogate father to Natalie Portman's character, who's the child from, the wife from a previous marriage, with a complete deadbeat dad. And she's just looking for guidance and just really a role model, really just a father figure in life, which ultimately leads to that moment towards the end where she feels so alone and cut off from everyone that she tries to take her own life, which is a beautiful moment, really well acted, I think, by Pacino in that moment where he finds her in the bathtub. And he plays it fantastically. Like, you really do get the sense that he is this really weathered cop. He's been doing this for years. You get the nice mention that he has had 3 failed marriages in the past, and you have to assume that it was down to him again being completely emotionally shut off. And all the things that he would have to see on a daily basis. Now, I've got one of my best friends is in the police. I'm not going to go into depth or everything, but he tells me stories of things that he's seen. And you can only imagine sort of taking that home up here and how you process that. And my friend always says you either deal with it in 2 ways. You make a joke about it and have like really dark sense of humor about it, or you turn to the bottle. And that's kind of what we see with his character in this. Now, he doesn't completely descend into alcoholism or anything like that, but there are some nice visual signifiers. And that, again, that's down to the direction, the writing, that elements in the foreground that you can plot, which also add to the character, the empty glasses or the bottle of whiskey in front of him constantly. Now, I do think his wife is very out of order, that she just purposely goes out of her way to cheat on him just to try and get a rise out of him. But he is completely emotionally cut off. But I can kind of understand him doing that, because he does give quite a compelling reason. He says that he has to keep himself sharp. He has to be almost thinking like the people he's going after in order to do what he does and to do the job that he does. So he's a really interesting character, but then you do pepper in those really over the top Pacino moments. It's like, I had coffee with Macaulay half an hour ago. And, it's all those bits. There's so many more. Every line's great that he does in this, but it's a beautiful pairing between the two. It really is.
Yeah. And I think that's what separates it, that I'm not saying it's an easy role. Of course it's not. It's that internal argument that he's having. It's that cold and calculated. And it's very much like Corleone, that he was the quiet one, but he's always thinking up there, and it's the same. And he's always thinking there's always something that's going to happen. And yes, it could be the outburst. And I think one thing that's fascinating, which is in a Q&A that he did with Christopher Nolan and the whole cast, the 20th anniversary, is that he kind of dropped it in front of Michael Mann, that we always said, I think they said they kept on to the secret of years, that he's a cocaine user within the film, the character. They said that there is a scene which they never put into the final cut, which actually has it. I'm not saying it shows him doing it, but I think he said something along the lines of that. It's very much hinted at being obvious. He says that, because I wouldn't have thought that. I mean, you could think of it for some things, but outright saying that is why the character has those moments where one minute he's at a low level, the next is at a high. And it was really fascinating hearing that from him, because it's him dropping revelations 20 years later. And I think it needed that Al Pacino touch to it, that playing that smart cop is something a lot of people can do. But then it comes down to who can hold their own opposite Robert De Niro in their prime. I guess we can say, I hate using that term, I've been using it on those recently. If you're going to have De Niro as the top dog, you wouldn't want to, not to be horrible, a B-lister or a C-lister to be the other guy, because you're automatically swaying straight to De Niro because it's De Niro. But if you bring in Al Pacino to match Robert De Niro, villain versus good guy, that sort of, I guess, head on head with one another, that's when you know that something's different about this, that you needed to have a legend on screen playing this character. And I think Al Pacino's able to bring his own things into it. You mentioned it to me, she's got a great ass line. It's really hard to say it in normal terms, not trying to scream like that.
Great ass, that one.
And
Brilliant.
you said to me, if you look at his mouth, you can see he's about to say big. And when I was doing the GIFs for the social media earlier, because the GIFs run slower, you can see the B about to form.
Yeah.
Vague stop, then it's great. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And I think he's just phenomenal. And you mentioned actually the scene with Natalie Portman, one of the best scenes, one of the many great scenes of the film. But when the fact that she's got her own backstory of the dad that's not there for her, and we're not saying her mom's a loser, but her mom's cheating on him with Ralph, which is also another great Pacino scene is with Ralph, where he doesn't care that she's cheated on him. But when he gets the telly outrage is just incredible. How he handles that, so funny, so well done. It's like, what's he going to say? Sit down, Ralph. And it's that kind of, I guess, I don't want to say Adam Driver-esque, but not many people can go from sort of 0 to 100 in like a millisecond. I think Pacino just does it in his own wavelength, and
it borders on overacting in some aspects. But I love it because that's a trope that I come to expect from that. It's like a Christopher Walken moment or a Nicolas Cage moment. There are certain tropes, like, around certain actors that you come to expect from their roles. So it just kind of adds to it.
Definitely, and I think with Pacino as well, that not to criticize the other guys, but when he needs to do the drama, he can do it as well. The Natalie Portman scene is heartbreaking. The whole build-up, what really creeps me out is like the way her arm flaps. Like it's, this happened last week actually. When you wake up at like in the morning, and I don't know if you've been leaning on your arm or something, and you've got like it like flaps around, and I was there like, that's terrifying to watch as well, because you can just like feel like just like hitting, and he does so well in that scene. And even when he gets to the hospital, he's giving the medical advice. He's in professional mode, and I think his wife's getting an insight into what he has to do for a living, that he isn't just a guy that drinks. He is switched on, and he is there to be able to react to anything. I think that's what works. But what's so beautiful about that scene is that they kind of discuss it, that Natalie Portman's character picked him. She went to his flat, not to the mom's, not to the dad. She went to his, because she probably deep down saw him as the real father figure to her. Even there's little moments. Another thing, he was doing his chewing of the gum.
It's just kind of
door like goes with it. It's amazing, and I don't know. It just Pacino. He's just wonderful, and I love seeing our Pacino films because you're going to get that, as you said, a Pacinoism, and it's getting the hints of them, and even Godfather 2, which is my favorite of the trilogy. I guess we can say trilogy. One of my favorite bits is when he screams like "in my home," and like and it's scary. It's that we always laugh at the Harvey Dent "say it" line or "shut up" when it scares you, and I think Pacino had that in him. But De Niro and Pacino, I mean, we can't really talk about having hype in 1995, but I'm trying to think right now that if there were two actors that have dominated, decades worth of films that you'd want to see on screen paired with one another right now today, that's a fascinating discussion for time. Who would it be? I'm really struggling to think what was the equivalent of these like two gods coming together. What's his name? Brad Pitt and DiCaprio to a point in Hollywood. They'd never acted with each other, and now they're both bros. Wasn't antagonist versus protagonist. They were just two dudes. And I'm just trying to think that imagine having us at this age.
Maybe Expendables to a degree with Stallone and Arnie in some way. I know it's not sort of like acting chops necessarily. You just want to see these two icons together. I guess it's like a similar thing with this.
Exactly. And I'm just trying to like put my mind into the fact that this no doubt was why this was marketed so high, that it was the first time they were acting with one another, and I just found that incredible. And another little Pacino behind the scenes, him and John Voight are best friends outside of film, apparently, outside of work. They have never acted with one another, and this is the only film the two have starred in, but they don't share a single scene.
Yeah.
And again, John Voight, Oscar winner, chucked in weird hillbilly 2 or 3 scenes, and anyone could have played that role, but you're bringing in these big name players, and they're all people that Michael Mann wanted as well. It's not that they needed big names or someone was attached to the project. He went out and outright recruited these people for the roles, and I think Pacino and De Niro, what they can do with one another, and I think that's why the coffee scene has the legacy it does today. It's not just the fact it's the tense scene, it's the respect of the rivals. It's the fact that was legitimately the first time people saw the two of them act with one another, and it is without a doubt one of the best scenes in I don't want to drop the word cinema history, no way, but in terms of what you could expect from how we spoke in the Malcolm and Marie view, that we like it when we can just see two actors going at one another, just the two of them. That's what you want, and I kind of, again, Dynamite, the interrogation scene. This is kind of like that. We've built up to this rivalry across the first hour. How is it going to play out face to face? And the two of them are just the fact it's in a public area. It's a coffee. They can't shout. They can't scream, and you've just got two people with a deep mutual respect for one another who are sitting there saying we're happy to go to war. I thought it's just perfection.
One of the best scenes in the film, and it was a really. To mention the build-up, one of my favorite scenes, or favorite shots, I should say, is where Pacino and his team are ready to bust De Niro and everyone in the warehouse, and it's almost like De Niro has a sixth sense, and he knows that someone's onto them, and he looks into the CCTV, and it's like this infrared, and he's just staring at him. And I mean, that's the perfect setup right there. But yeah, I mean, the coffee scene speaks for itself. It's easily one of the best scenes in the film. You could argue it is the best scene in the film, in that these two get to play off each other so beautifully in this scene. And this was, I think the whole coffee scene was based, going back to that true story I mentioned in the 60s between Chuck Adamson and Macaulay, the real Macaulay. They also had a moment where they had a chat in the coffee shop at some point, apparently. And you really see that, deep down, if any other circumstances, these could just be mates. They really just sit down. They're just like any ordinary guys, but they are completely unwavering in their line of work and what they do. And one of my favorite lines, he says, like, did you ever want a normal life? And he says, what's a normal life? Like, let's say barbecue and to go and see the game. And you kind of look at it in both ways, in that Pacino kind of has a normal life in a way. He's like married. He's got like the family lifestyle almost, but he's so disconnected from it, and he wants that thrill. He needs that thrill. It's like you complete me again, going to the Dark Knight. And fair play, I just do want to say this, fair play to Nolan for seeing this film and going, I can draw comparisons between this with these two comic book characters. Like that is genius in and of itself, and we'll talk about that comparison later. But there are loads of moments like this, and yeah, I mean, everything kind of is set on this one moment between these two, because if you didn't nail that dynamic, the entire rest of the film wouldn't work at all.
Yeah.
But it's testament to the writing, and it's just how normal these two guys are. It's almost like, if I could, I'd shake your hand, but if it comes down to it and you're going to make someone a widow, I'm taking you down. And on the flip side, well, if you come between me and my escape, you're going down as well. May the best man win, kind of thing. And ultimately, at the end, they do have that connection with like the hand, when he holds his hand before he dies. But yeah, the coffee shop scene is easily one of the best scenes in the film, hands down.
Definitely. I'm trying to think where to head to next.
We should talk about the supporting characters, I think. But yeah, there's so much to unpack with this. This is mad. This might be our longest review we've done.
Let's talk Val Kilmer. An actor that I have seen, I think, in only 3 films. Me being genuinely honest, I'm convinced I've only seen Heat, Top Gun, and Batman Forever. That Val Kilmer starred in. There's maybe one or two. And whenever I see him in these films, I like him in them. And this film, the poster, the long hair, the everything, and the name I was going to say. This is why it's going to change your mind. So this came out the same year as Batman Forever, and filming was, I don't know if it was simultaneously to it or adjacent. Makes sense, he's wearing the wig. Because they didn't know if he could fit it in, they cast Keanu Reeves in that role. Now, imagine the bank scene with Keanu Reeves, John Wick, not Val Kilmer. Anyway, when he figured out that he could do Batman at the same time as Heat, he was able to then sign up to that, and they politely had to let Keanu go.
But then Keanu got his own heist film, didn't he? I think probably before this, didn't he, with Point Break?
Point Break's before, and I'm just starting thinking, could you have imagined if that was Keanu? More of the fact that John Wick 20 years later, because he basically is John Wick in that scene, let's be honest. But Val Kilmer in this he's great. I mean, he's the cool one, he's got the fun wife, and he's the one that's the most troubled in the issues, but he's kind of the young gun of the crew. He doesn't look that young, but he's the young one for them. And I think with DeNiro, what I love most in this, I know it's jumping ahead to the fight, because I wouldn't say he's as developed as the others, but he certainly has some of the most powerful moments in the film. But it's when he gets shot in the bank raid. For some reason, I was thinking he gets headshotted, but it must be like top of the shoulder. Yeah. And this is De Niro, the calculated guy, goes straight back for him. He is not there to because I thought not that it's too modern, but because that's the song, I was like, oh, does Val Kilmer die in this bit, and does he just take the money off him and go? No, he doesn't. He takes him with him. He saves him, and that's what I loved, is the relationship between the two of them. The fact that Val Kilmer's going over to his house and he's sleeping over there on the night when he's had issues, is there's almost a brotherly bond for the two of them, and you kind of want them both to do so well. And I don't know, I really enjoy him in it, and he has the happy ending, and because he exits the film, not even at the ending, he exits at probably, let's say, the 3/4 of the way into it. You kind of forget about him because his story arc is complete. Now, not to read it out, but I think we'll get into it later with all the characters, but every character has their own ending. And we spoke earlier how it's all about the relationships with the characters and their partners and whatnot. Val Kilmer is the only survivor of the robbers, but ultimately he loses everything. He loses his wife, he can't see her anymore, he loses his hair, he has to have a new identity in a new place, and yes, he gets to live, but he has to live away from everything he's ever had. So does he really win? And that's what I keep coming back to with this film, is those moments like that yes, he lived, but is he really living?
Yeah, and I mean, all the members of the gang have their own vices, don't they? They mention in that moment where you said, where De Niro goes over and he's almost like a brother to him. He's making him breakfast and everything after he's had a falling out with his wife. He says, like, haven't you got any money stashed away? And he's just like, gambled it. And he's like a complete gambling addict. Like, all those millions or thousands or however much they made in the past, all gone. Completely gambled. He's bankrupt again. And no matter how much money they would get from this heist that they end up getting, it would all be gone again, and the cycle would keep repeating because they need this lifestyle. And I think I definitely think that De Niro and Val Kilmer get the most development, I would say, out of the main gang. You have Wayne Grow, who is just kind of like a nutcase, and that he just sustains that throughout the entire rest of the film. And then you have, Tom Sizemore's character, but there isn't really much to him. There's the moment where they're all sat round at dinner and he mentions that he hasn't got a clue what he's doing. So it just seems like it's a fun spur of the moment thing. There's no sort of direction there. Whereas you get the sense that out of all of them, Robert De Niro is the only one with a plan. Maybe deep down, Val Kilmer has a plan as well. Like he genuinely wants that family life. And, he has a really great wife, he's got a child as well, but his lifestyle, it just wouldn't be sustainable. And ultimately, everyone ultimately pays the price at the end of the film, don't they? They all kind of get their comeuppance. It's like a cautionary tale, as I mentioned earlier, with De Niro's character. But no, I love Val Kilmer. Val Kilmer's a tremendous actor. I've seen a few more films with him in than you have. He does play the spirit of Elvis Presley in True Romance, which is one of my favorite, very, very small Val Kilmer roles. I don't actually think you see his face in that film. But Willow is another one. He's tremendous in Willow. He's in a bunch of other stuff as well. But yeah, he's great. It's perfectly offset at the end. And I keep thinking to moments like this where, yeah, he does just drive off and we don't really get, that's just left open-ended. I was thinking the Natalie Portman stuff, she's in hospital, but I was thinking, should we have had some kind of reunion scene where after the end of the film, Pacino goes back to the hospital or sits at a bedside or something, or there's a moment of reconciliation. But I think it intentionally leaves some stuff up in the air because even they don't know what's going to happen. You have the scene going back to Pacino briefly where they're sat in the hospital waiting room, and there's almost a moment where it's like, is there a chance for us to rekindle this? And he says, I haven't got a clue. I don't know. And then she realized, she says, like, go out and do what you do. And there's kind of that moment of like respect, like this is, and he's straight out the door. He's like a dog out of the track. Just he starts running, and it's like this makes him feel alive. So, yeah, it's kind of a weird, bittersweet ending, not just because of the death of De Niro's character at the end and that mutual respect, but also the fact that you kind of left kind of clueless as to where all these threads are going to go on. And I'm not saying I want a sequel. I know that there's been sequel talks as well. It's way too late for a sequel now. And even if you'd have made this 2 years after, I wouldn't have wanted a sequel to this film. I think it's the perfect ending for it, but I like that it does leave some things intentionally in the open, ambiguous.
Yeah, and I think the ambiguity is really good with it because the ambiguous storylines are the other half to the characters. We've had their storylines finished, if that makes sense. So because Val Kilmer drives away, we're done with him. We don't need to see his wife again. And we know her situation is that she's in their house with the police waiting for Val Kilmer to turn up to arrest him still. So we don't know what's going to happen there.
No, don't.
And I love that because I've forgotten. Someone was like, oh, she's going to betray him. She's going to betray him. I understand why. They've basically made her do it. She knows that she has to do it. And it's just that I thought she was going to take the ring off, but it's just that. And I was like, oh wow. And you can see the heartbreak in his eyes. His eyes start to well up, and he knows what he's got to do. And then when that sniper gets on the roof and they're IDing the car, I love the fact that the camera's focusing on her listening into the walkie-talkies in the lounge, because she is shitting it, because she's, even though they're clearly a terrible couple, she still loves him, and they've got a kid, and she wants him to do well for himself. And that's what I found fascinating, was that side of it. And with Tom Sizemore's character, he doesn't have as much development because he's the one with the family. And I think De Niro's like, I don't want you to do this one. I want you to sit this one out. You've got a family. This is our last job. Could all go wrong. Signing a death sentence on the spot, I guess we can always say. And you kind of know that if he's the family man and that he kind of scared that word because he loves it too much, he's probably going to go. And, you know, that's the end of him. That's his act. And we don't see his family. And even the driver, apologies, I've forgotten his name. He's probably got the saddest backstory, that he's on probation. His probation officer recommends him for a job, and he has the typical awful manager who's, you know, if you don't do what I tell you, I'm going to say that you beat me up. I'm going to say you did this. You'll be straight back in prison. No questions asked, because they've all got my word. And I love it when films do this way. You just follow this individual that's ultimately meaningless, but it adds more life to it. You get his girlfriend / fiance, and he's questioning, why does she want to be with him? He's a loser. He's flipping burgers for a living. It's because she loves him and she wants him to have a new start. And when you get that sort of scene of her at the bar, worried that her partner's not come home, and then she sees the TV screen that he's been killed in the gun shoot, and you just see her sort of cheek twitching. And that's her character act done too. It's quite fascinating how everything comes and goes at these characters doing that. I understand why we'd want to see those other scenes, but I think ending it on Pacino and De Niro, I think, is what the film deserves. It could have had easily that sort of epilogue moment of it all being hunky-dory with the family, or Natalie Portman's character waking up. I assume should be fine, but the way the film ends is just perfect with the two sort of holding on to him. You know, yes, he's a murderer, yes, he's a killer, but he's still deep down, he probably doesn't want him to die. And he just did it because he had to do it, because it was either going to be him or De Niro. And it's so well written. And those supporting characters. And again, not just the writing, the performances. There's not one bit of bad casting. Yes, Wayne Groves the psycho, but we even get to learn about him. And do we really need to? Nope, but we do. Even, I always forget his name. His character is called Van Damme, the bank manager from The Dark Knight.
What's his name? William Fisher. There we go.
That's it. And because I was watching it with my dad, and he'd never seen Heat before. Straight away, he's like, "That's the guy from the opening scene of The Dark Knight." And I was like, "Oh, I've trained him well on Batman films, haven't I?" And again, the ultimate. We'll get to Nolan, but the ultimate. That's the full circle nod of respect, isn't it? Was casting him for the bank scene, but even he's got a payoff. He's got an intro. We learn about his life and what he's doing, how sly he is. And even his death's pretty perfect. Yes, it's part of the plot, but everyone's got a story and a character arc and people with them to make it so. And it's just perfect. I don't know if I've missed out any characters, any performers, but I don't think I can fault anything in the performances in the film.
Yeah, and Danny Trejo's also in the film. I quite like his final moment where he is just being completely beaten up and just in a horrible state. And again, going back to what we said there earlier about Robert De Niro, where he has that code, he does put him out of his misery and does pull the trigger to end his suffering. But you mentioned Nolan there, and I think that's a perfect segue to get onto the main scene of inspiration. I think not just the scene of inspiration, there are plenty of other parallels that we can draw, which we'll probably get onto in a second. But the bank robbery scene, easily sort of like the biggest action spectacle set piece of the movie. Everything sort of hinges on this moment in terms of the action. And yeah, I mean, in hindsight with The Dark Knight, I was kind of watching this scene with that in mind. I think it's pretty unavoidable too now, with how big that film was. And yeah, you can quite clearly see where that inspiration came from this scene. We mentioned about De Niro's character and how he is kind of being nice in the situation as much as he can be, in between breaking people's noses on the long way. But the gunfire and just the sensory overload, and when you learn that they got a British SAS trained guy to teach them weapons training, and you see that on camera, like when Val Kilmer's there shooting his way out, and he's like a perfect machine of reloading and position changing and everything like that. It all comes to a head. And you told me, you prepped me, you said, turn that volume up all the way. And I'm very glad that I did. It's mad. You know more about it than me in terms of like the sound, and they captured it all in camera or something, didn't they, I think?
Yeah, so I think what's worth mentioning is that the whole film is shot on location. Not one soundstage is used, which led to the film being a much longer shoot than needed to be. But this was shot on the streets of LA. We're not from LA, as you can tell. We're in England. Neither of us have been to LA yet. And we see LA via films, and obviously the Nolan one is, we always say, don't we, that it's Chicago, and Nolan's always said that the big city inspiration was watching Heat. It's like, okay, bank robbery, yes, and it's when even the build up to when the shooting starts, the fact that that the robbery has gone well, it's too smooth. 3 of them are in the car, it's all going well, and one of my favorite shots of the entire film is the build up of the police coming. The people make jokes saying that how long was Pacino running down that street for, because it feels like it's going forever, and this tension's building. You've got an amazing soundtrack going on in the background, which I was listening to at work today. It sounded like I was about to rob somewhere, but I really wasn't. I was just on my desk. And it's just this brief moment where Val Kilmer's smiling, job done, and then the corner of his eye, he sees someone with a gun, and it's almost like the Terminator. The smile drops, machine gun straight up, the shooting starts, and those first gunshots is... I hate the Dark Knight comparison for this bit. Some films obviously use a lot of ADR to do gunshots. I understand why, that they want quieter sets, they want to put dialogue into it, and not that it sounds fake, it just doesn't sound real. Not that we go around and watch terrorist videos and stuff like that, but when news clips have shown things like that and you hear gunshots, it's the echo that always has that effect, because it's not the things you get to hear on film. Not in Heat, you don't. The gunfire in Heat in this scene is the story is that to shoot on the streets of LA, they could only film at weekends. So the bank scene was filmed over 6 weeks. Every weekend for 6 weeks, the streets were locked down for them to do this. Which is probably furious to people in LA. But what was more fascinating was that rather than have the normal cameras rolling and just ADR the gunfire in, Michael Mann set up microphones all along the blocks and the streets, so that every gunshot was picked up via the blanks they were firing on set. And what that sound was able to do was make it sound real, because that's how it would have sounded during filming. And I think when I was watching this scene, not that I'd forgotten how loud it is, but that's why it sounded so different. It felt more harrowing. It was the fact that it was real, and obviously not to be some weird sound scientist guy, but when you've got skyscrapers above you, obviously sound travels acoustics. Acoustics, that's it. Yeah, exactly. And it was those things like this, and then you see more and more. And when you've got officers being killed that you've seen on screen for an hour, and they don't gloss over, there's no heroic slow motion, there's none of that. It's brutal. There's these people being killed. They'll often cut to shots of the wounded on the floor, and it's such an incredible build-up. And even the gunshots in the cars. So what I was reading as well, any cars that showed get shot by bullets or whatnot, They took them to somewhere in the week. They shot bullets at them with real guns, and then they filled the bullet holes with putty, painted over it on the day of filming, did some stuff where it probably popped out, and then they reversed the footage. So even they were real gunshots. And this is, I sat here thinking, and I'm not hyping this up too much, but I always say that the opening 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan to me is the best 20 minutes of cinema, and it still is. But I started thinking, this bank robbery here, that's got to be up there from a technical angle of something. That there are so many fantastic things, but the fact that how this was shot, again, you mentioned the SAS people being brought on board. Val Kilmer in this, it was brutal and it was real, and I think that's the key. They went in with reality, and I'll let you have your say, because there are some unfortunate real life tragedies that came from this, and we're not those kind of channels that say XYZ is the reason of ABC. No, it's people, individuals. But Heat didn't just inspire films, video games. It unfortunately inspired many real life shootings in the years that followed it in the same manner. And because of those shootings, gun laws were changed to give cops automatic rifles at the time. And here we are in 2021 knowing that cops shouldn't have automatic rifles. But it's because back then they had semi. I'm not an advocate for guns, but it's fictional TV. I don't know. I've spoken loads. I want to hear your thoughts, because I was
the real life violence and everything like that. I mean, obviously, I don't condone that or what, and I don't really know all the events that did happen from it. But it's always a very controversial case with me. It's usually always pointed at video games. It's like, oh, the reason this person killed this person was because of this video game. We should ban all video games or video games like this. And I guess I kind of have to go with my argument on films with that, in that I don't think a film or a video game necessarily makes a violent person. It takes the person, their own psyche and what they do.
They're already broken.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not going to say Heat is a horrible film for inspiring all of these robberies and all of these deaths and all of these gun crimes, because the person made a choice to do that. Heat is just a great film, a great character film, and a great crime film on the surface. But if someone takes that and does what they do with it, then hey, that's their prerogative. But and I don't think it glorifies it anyway.
No,
like it doesn't make it like you can go, that is a fantastically well written, well directed, well choreographed scene. Everything's in place. One of the best scenes in cinema history. But it doesn't make you go like, oh, I want to be part of that, because as we've mentioned from all the characters, they all live really like fucked up and horrible lives, and they all kind of end badly. So it doesn't glorify it in any way, shape or form. And, where you talk about like the officers going down as well, like you do feel it, although it is very quick, because the incident is quick. And I guess if you are in that situation, you wouldn't have time to, go and help someone, because you would be in the moment. So it's very ground level as well. And I think this is down to just Mann's directing. I'm looking at some other films that he's directed. It'd actually be great to go through some more Mann films in our retro reviews that we do. Looking at The Manhunter, which was the first sort of take on Silence of the Lambs. It was Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter. You've got Last of the Mohicans. Collateral is another great example of another fantastic action film as well, directed by him. But the fact that he captures everything in camera, I think that really adds to it. Now, there is one scene that we both talked about where we both thought it was done on a green screen. And I don't know what it is about it. I don't know if it's the lighting, but it almost looked like you could see the outline cut around the actor and that sort of distance with the background. But it's a scene where DeNiro's with the woman. Oh my God, I can't find the name of the actress, but the one who he falls in love with, and they're overlooking the city of LA. That did kind of look a bit green screeny, but I take his word for it. If no effect shots were done in the film, if everything was in camera, then fair play. I don't quite know what was going on with that shot. But that's another thing, like the style and the mood of it. And I think this is quite like Mann's style, is just those moments where you just see the city of LA, or you just get that sense of environment. And there's this sort of like beautiful ambient electric guitar in the background, and it does really set that mood. It really does. It's a good mood setter film, I think, in the environment that it's set in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what works with this, is that for those skyscrapers, for that big effect, and for it to, I guess, be what it is, you do need that big city aspect. And ironically, not to go to another film, I had a lot of Inception vibes. I don't know if you did the level one on Inception when they're in Dream One, and you've got the car chase, the gunshots on the
yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, I had some Inception vibes, but I think that's because it was filmed in LA, so it's probably actually a lot more like it. And respect for him to go in Chicago for Dark Knight because it's a different city, it would have been too obvious. But I think the city feels like a character in this as well. And you know, look at this background on the channel. You know, it's in the poster, it's everywhere. It's that city, and I think LA is as important to this film as the characters and everything else, that you need a setting to be able to pull that off. And I think as that green screen thing you mentioned is weird because it feels so. You think it's green screen. I don't know how they did it. I want to try and find out because it stands out. But the fact that all this was shot on location, and one of Man's requirements was to go to places that have never already been used on films. So the fact that the research team was going out, probably going to a street or whatever, you know, pre-internet days, and trying to do research. Has this street appeared in films before and whatnot? Because if you go somewhere recognizable,
or scouting was like half a year. I think it took them half a year to do it. So they took the time with it.
And I think the coffee scene, going back to that they spoke in an interview that this was a tourist hotspot for almost 20 years. The restaurant closed in 2014, but apparently they had a hung photo up of Al Pacino and Robert DeNiro there together. They did a shot from the film. You kind of see that in places, but you could book tables in advance and you could request the heat table. I mean, that's like the ultimate. Obviously, it's a shame it's shut. They spoke about in the Q&A, but it's the fact that it is shot on location. I think gives it that extra edge that you can tell it's not a soundstage. You can tell that this is their own. This is on set. This is real, and I think that's what enhances everything we see on the screen. Even the houses, when some of them are obviously on like the hills and whatnot that you get in LA. Some of them are down low in suburbs, or the restaurants and things like that. Could have been so easy to have four identical studio bedrooms, but each and every one feels different because they went to reality. And sorry, another weird behind the scenes fact. So where Danny Trejo's character dies, the couple that own the house that he lives at, or maybe bought it since, said that underneath the carpet there is still a red blood stain from the fake blood they used on the film, saying they could never get it out, but they wanted to pay respect to the film. It's a bit creepy. I'm guessing it's covered up, but they said it's also bright red. It's not what anyone would think it would look like. But that's pretty mad. Like, imagine like the claim to fame is that you own the house where Danny Trejo has been killed in heat, but you've just happily left the blood stains on the floor.
You would do it if it was like a main film, though, wouldn't you? If something was at your house and something was left behind, you'd leave it. You'd never wash that carpet. You'd keep it where it is. That's pretty cool, though. So again, like a lot of influences from this. I mean, do we want to still? I feel like every sentence is going to be, and then Christopher Nolan did this, and Christopher Nolan was inspired by this. If we're talking about another Nolan film, though, that I sort of drew parallels to, you mentioned Inception. Probably the easiest one to go to, other than Dark Knight, is Insomnia. Not just because it's starring Pacino, but also because it's starring Pacino. But that similar dynamic to this, you know, that sort of morally grey, sort of, you know, similar kind of characters and how they act, and a kind of respect that comes from that, like the cat and mouse chase, very, very similar to Insomnia in that way. Or Insomnia is similar to this, I will say. Other parallels that you can draw, and I'm going to rattle through this really quickly with Dark Knight. You could do a whole video essay, and I'm sure that someone probably has done a video essay on this on YouTube already, or a written dissertation or something. The character style between Pacino and De Niro, very similar to Batman and the Joker, respectively, in in Dark Knight. The coffee scene, interrogation scene, the bank robbery speaks for itself. Williams Fichtner's inclusion, but also kind of the emotionally cut off side to Bruce Wayne, in that ultimately his relationship is doomed to fail because of the life that he lives and his dedication to what he does. Very similar to the Rachel situation. I had one more. The final line that De Niro says to, the guy who he goes to the hotel for. Why do I keep forgetting his name?
Waingro.
Waingro, that's it. He says, "Look at me. Look at me." And it just reminded me of the Joker right there in that scene, said in a very different way, but there's probably 1,000 more comparisons that you can find between the two. I don't want to sort of dwell on it too much because I do want to keep the focus on Heat, but it is unavoidable at this point. And I think there's a fine line between homage and straight up ripping something off. And I don't want to say that The Dark Knight completely rips it off. There are some scenes, like the bank robbery scene, like elements of it. But you mentioned something earlier where you were like, Nolan was very open about it, and that he was heavily inspired by certain scenes, certain character archetypes, maybe, or tone. But as I mentioned, to watch this film and go, I'm going to basically take that film and extrapolate that, put it into DC comic book world, and switch these characters out for Batman and Joker and make it work in this world. It's incredible. And I was watching this and I was like, it kind of is a perfect fit. If you are going to sort of personify that dynamic between Batman and Joker, I don't think there's any other better film really to depict that other than Heat. And that's exactly what he did.
And I think the other thing's fascinating because we don't normally delve into sort of what influenced what, but I think because Chris Pine has been so open in regards to his love for Heat, I don't know if he's. I think 2000. I think the obvious ones he's always spoke about 2001: A Space Odyssey, Interstellar, no questions asked, and of course Heat. And I think what I was watching yesterday was I think it's on the most recent Blu-ray release, or however many they did of it, for the 20th anniversary in 2015. Christopher Nolan hosted a Q&A for the Academy, and it had Michael Mann, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro. Basically, by the end of it, there's about 10, 15 people. You can only see snippets on YouTube, so I like to try and find the full thing. Apparently, it's over an hour long. And you can tell that he's having the time of his life. And he's probably already met all these people before, but you just know that for someone like him, who's had one of the biggest films in history that he's made now, and the fact that he's able to be open about his inspirations from it and say, now I'm hosting a Q&A for its anniversary, and everyone knows who I am, but they all know these guys too. I think there's something nice about him. And I do get what you mean with ripping off. I don't want to say it rips stuff off. It feels like, because he's so open about paying, it feels more like he's paying respect that, I love this film so much. I'm going to certainly Dark Knight more so than Begins and Rises, I would definitely say. And that is the Joker angle more than anything. That I think with the prologue, with the opening scene, it is that this is a short film. This is 6 minutes long. This film's going to be a lot like Heat, so I'm going to have my own bank robbery. I'm going to bring in a character from Heat. If it wasn't already obvious, I love Heat as a film. He's going to get a little cameo, but it's all this, not that it's all connected type vibe, but I feel as if it's done in the right way. It's not. There's nothing shot for shot remake. There's no hockey masks. There's no shootout in the street. There's nothing that's a carbon copy of what happens in that, and I think that's why if it had turned around and the Joker would have said something like, if you've got heart problems, please stand by the door. We're not stealing your money, we're stealing the mob's money. Yeah, like that would be like, that's a bit too much for my standards. But I think because it's done tastefully, I like it even more because it's that ultimate sign of respect. And it's just you could go on for ages.
I think that's what it ultimately comes down to. Like, I think you can be inspired by things like even. You mentioned like the Nolan interview with George Lucas. George Lucas, Star Wars was massively inspired by a load of things. Flash Gordon, it's all out there. Flash Gordon and the sci-fi serials, adventure serials, and real life history and Japanese cinema as well. Like all the ingredients were there from other stuff. But George Lucas made that his own. And I think that Nolan did the same. Like I wouldn't watch Heat and Dark Knight and go, it's a carbon copy. You can see the similar elements and character parallels that you could sort of draw between the two. But they are fundamentally their own unique films and function as their own unique films. And there's no moments where you go, that's directly lifted from that. You go, oh, that's similar, but it's not. That's a straight ripoff. And I think that's ultimately where imitation comes down to. You get certain sequels or continuations where they do fall heavily on, do you remember this exact imagery that you've already seen? And then that's when it kind of gets into the rip-off stage and it becomes more manipulative. But it was never done that way, I don't think. I think this is, out of all the retro reviews we've done, probably the one that we've compared the most to another film. But I think that that just goes to show the strengths of this film in the inspiration that it did have with other prolific filmmakers. It wasn't sort of a one-and-done crime film. It is head and shoulders above much of the rest in terms of crime films. I don't know where I'd rank this in terms of like a top 3 or a top 5 of crime films, because it's such a big genre, and in that genre specifically, there are some absolutely like best films of all time category, caliber kind of films. Godfather, obviously falling into that category as well. But I had such a blast rewatching this. I know that we can talk about like favorite scenes and moments. I feel like we've kind of already done that. At least I've touched on my one. But my God, go and see this film. If you haven't seen this film already, I mean, why are you still watching this? We've spoiled the whole film. You've ruined the whole film for yourself. But even if you have seen it, it's been a while, go back and check it out. I'm so glad we picked this today for retro reviews, because if we hadn't, God knows when I would have next got around to this film. So yeah, and this is why I love this show. This is like one of my favorite shows to do on the channel. It's just great to go back to these films, and I had a blast with it. It didn't feel 3 hours; it flew by. You know, it keeps you hooked. The writing, direction, so strong. And as I mentioned already, Michael Mann. I would love to go back to some previous Michael Mann films. Maybe a full filmography. I don't know, but certainly a few of the key hitters, because he has done some fantastic films. I couldn't recommend Heat enough. If you're a fan of crime films, or really just good cinema, good performances, absolutely check this one out.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a must watch. If you've seen it, not in a long time, then go check it on. The Dark Knight comparison, sorry, just the last thing on that is, if you would show someone that's never seen Heat, that doesn't know anything about Heat, but they've seen The Dark Knight and they know The Dark Knight, a lot of people probably our ages are polite with saying it as well. I bet you they would say that reminds me a lot of The Dark Knight, and it is that it's so well done. And yeah, let's not get into the rip-off remakes and stuff, because even Lucas, to be fair to him, the biggest I think take-home inspiration for the Star Wars films is, he always said, President Nixon and America at the time, and obviously, well, we definitely know the current Star Wars films didn't replicate that, because we don't have a weird Jabba the Hutt in charge of the galaxy. Anyway, that being said, no, Heat. If you're a fan of De Niro or Pacino, there's a good chance you've already seen it. But if you just want to get taken out of it, go into this elaborate, over-the-top crime film where you're going to sympathize with the characters, you're going to love the characters, you're going to feel for them, even though you know what's about to happen to them, this is the film for you. It's an almost 3-hour journey just into I want to say, a bygone era of cinema, because we just don't get things like this anymore. And I think the peak of it is here. It's just a phenomenal gangster film, and it's kind of what we said at the start of the video. There's a way this can somehow get re-released. Its 25th anniversary was December, so we had no cinemas open that could have covered it, which is a massive shame. So I thoroughly recommend this film. This is one of the funnest retro reviews we've done. We've loved all the retro reviews we've done, but we've not been able to go an hour and a half into it, which is madly enough not even half the length of the film yet. So I'm going to kind of round off my piece of just go and see this masterpiece. And if you've not seen it for a long time, the chances are it's going to be better than you remember.
Definitely. I think it kind of dawned on us, didn't it, when we started talking about De Niro's character and how much you can talk about, like, oh, this is going to be a long one. This might be one of our longest retro reviews. I don't know how long we've gone on previous retro reviews. I've got to say this is clocking in as probably one of the longest, but that just goes to show how much there is to talk about this film and how much there is to unpack with it. But that'll do it for our retro review on Heat. There's so much more to talk about this film, and we want to open it up to you guys as well to continue the conversation about this film. So please feel free to comment below, like, comment, share, subscribe. We want to get as many people involved in these retro reviews that we do week to week as well. We are very random with them. Sometimes we'll take on a series of films, a trilogy, whatever it happens to be, a franchise. Other times we'll do standalone ones. I can say that next week, so next Tuesday again, we always do retro reviews every Tuesday at 8 p.m. GMT. We are going back to a trilogy of films with this one, so another franchise with this. And we are going back to the 80s, although the third one technically did come out in 94, so you could say there's arguably a gap there between the 80s and the 90s. We are building up to, well, there is a new Eddie Murphy film coming out in a month's time, I believe now, with Coming to America, and we wanted to kind of take on probably one of the biggest series of films that he's done. No, it's not Nutty Professor. Maybe that can be a retro review for another time, because I do love those films, but we're going to be talking about the Beverly Hills Cop films. So next Tuesday, we'll be going back to the original 1984 Beverly Hills Cop, and then subsequent weeks, each week after that, we'll be taking on Beverly Hills Cop 2 from 87 and Beverly Hills Cop 3 from 94. They're going to be really fun ones to go to, and George, I don't believe you've seen those ones, have you?
No, it's new to me. Because Coming to America is coming out, and I think I said I've not seen many Eddie Murphy films. Just the more the ones I've grown up with, I've not seen his older ones, which is ironic because he was not funny in the 80s. Of course, he was funny, but I've seen a stand up from the 80s, but it's films from the 80s. So it's about time where I make that jump and catch up. So I'm really looking forward to that one.
This is peak Eddie Murphy, like 80s Eddie Murphy. He was untouchable in that decade. So that's going to be really fun to go back to. So join us next week for Beverly Hills Cop. And as always, if you want to see what else we're doing, because we've got a lot of content coming out, increasingly more so as the months and weeks are going on. So please follow us on our social media: Facebook at Cinema Savvy, Twitter at Cinema_Savvy, and we have the TeePublic link in the description down below. And if you're not tired of us yet, you can check in this Friday for our weekly review series on WandaVision. Every Friday at 8 p.m. GMT. Once again, we're going through Disney Plus's latest Marvel series with WandaVision. We're having a lot of fun with that. There's a lot of mystery between episodes. So if you want to see us dissect those and go through those episodes week to week, please check that out too. That'll do it from us. This has been a blast tonight. So thank you to everyone that's watched, and we'll see you on the next video. Take care, everyone.